Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Jonathan Corrado. I'm the Policy Director here at the Korea Society.
And my name is Chelsie Alexandre, and I'm the Policy Program Officer here at the Korea Society.
Today's discussion will examine the twists and turns, the ups and downs, and the broader implications of yesterday's very first meeting between South Korea's new president, Lee Jae-myung, and U.S. President Donald Trump. Just to set the table, the meeting began with short speeches and a press conference, followed by a closed-door luncheon discussion. Altogether, the two leaders spent about 2.5 hours together. Afterwards, there was a Korea-U.S. business roundtable, and in the evening, President Lee spoke at CSIS. The allies have not issued a joint statement, or at least not yet, but we do nonetheless have a good sense for the major issues that they touched upon. To find out what exactly happened and what it all means, we're joined by two terrific experts to help us break it down. Chelsie, can you introduce our first speaker?
Yeah, absolutely. We're delighted to welcome back Dr. Katrin Katz, the Korea Society's inaugural Van Fleet Nonresident Senior Fellow. Katrin is a former director for Japan, Korea, and Oceanic Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council, where she served from 2007 to 2008. She's also a professor of practice in the Department of Political Science at the University of Miami and a fellow in the Office of the Korea Chair at CSIS. Thank you for joining us, Katrin.
Thank you. Good to see you, Chelsie, Jonathan, Josh.
Welcome, Katrin. And next, we're delighted to bring aboard for the very first time Josh Smith, who is Korea Bureau Chief for Reuters News Agency. Josh has covered North and South Korea since 2017, including the tensions during the 2017 period, the Trump-Kim summits in 2018 and 2019, a reporting trip to Pyongyang, and South Korea's recent martial law crisis. Josh, welcome to the show.
They're glad to be joining.
All right. I just want to add here that the Korea Society thanks our corporate sponsors and individual members and the Korea Foundation for their generous support, which has made this program possible. We've already received questions from some of our virtual attendees, and we'll be getting to those after the moderated discussion. You can submit questions live during the program by emailing policy@koreasociety.org. I'll be monitoring that during the program. And just a reminder that we do prioritize questions that come from our members. So that's another reason to sign up for Korea Society membership today. And so, Jonathan, with that, I will turn it over to you for the moderator questions.
Thank you, Chelsie. All right, let's dive right in. So we're going to start with overall impressions for how we think the summit went from the U.S. point of view, from the Korean point of view. Of course, yesterday morning started with a bit of drama concerning a Truth Social post, but this gave way to a fairly cordial meeting that touched on a lot of core areas. A personal relationship seems to have formed between the two leaders. President Lee commiserated with President Trump over the fact that both have been victims of attempted assassinations. And of course, there's a lot more follow-up work to be done and some things that we don't know. But overall, how do we think this meeting went? Katrin, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. Happy to kick off. I think generally for South Korea, a sigh of relief. I think the body language in the Oval Office setting, which is, of course, the main arena that we were able to see. We don't yet have a joint statement, so we can't see further details. But the big picture things, even if you had hit mute on that Oval Office, meeting and just looked at how the leaders were interacting, minus the content. You have to, I think, credit Lee Jae-myung for prep in readying himself for that, readying himself for anything, right? I think he kind of knew that some curveballs might come, and he seemed, he was very charming and very respectful, but he was also very comfortable there, ready for anything. I think that comes from prep. He said he read Art of the Deal. This was in the later CSIS speech. I think it also comes from conviction. I think you can't fake that, right? So he walked in and he said, I've been out of the frying pan into the fire. He didn't say that. He cited it later. This is a time to kind of reconsider from the ground up, what does my country need for its security and prosperity? And guess what? We're in uncertain time, and the answer is still the United States, right? Later, I think the CSIS speech was quite interesting. I think he's comfortable with reframing the relationship around national interests. So saying, we can reset. This isn't old wine and new bottles. We can, take care of ourselves. This isn't about charity. This is about reciprocity, and we will survive this. So he brought that message to Trump in the Oval Office. He was confident and comfortable. And that, even minus, we'd love to see the details of the joint statement. We're still waiting to see if there will be one. But that in and of itself, that no drama kind of non-headline, that's a win for South Korea. And I would argue for the United States as well.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Katrin. Josh, over for you for your takeaway.
I mean, I think that's exactly the message we heard when we spoke to both analysts and experts here in South Korea and in Washington. A bit of a sigh of relief. Basically, in that CSIS speech afterwards, Lee said himself, the kind of the shadow of that Zelensky Oval Office meeting from February was hanging heavy over their minds. They didn't know what kind of reception they might get going into Washington. And Lee said he was prepared for, having read Art of the Deal and kind of, reached out for tips from folks, that he was prepared for kind of tough initial negotiating tactics by Trump, but then kind of expected him to come to a reasonable conclusion in the end. But I think, he noted that his staff didn't know how tough Trump was going to be, and I think they were really worried about that going in. And so, as Katrin said, they had prepared, and I think that did show. A lot of the folks that we had talked to before the summit had said, kind of the best course would be to try to focus on kind of really big picture, shared kind of goals, some of that pragmatism that Katrin mentioned, and that Lee has kind of really played up as a commonality between him and Trump, and then try to leave some of the details where there's a little bit more friction between the two sides and some unresolved issues there for a later time. And that seems to be basically exactly what happened.
Sounds great. And of course, different communities within the US and Korea are going to have different takeaways about how effective the meeting was and what the implications are going forward. So can you talk us through some of that? And Josh, we'll start with you on that one.
Sure. I think we saw, some criticism and praise that broke down along partisan lines here a bit in South Korea. But I think, when Lee came to office, for example, he was met by a lot of skepticism from kind of really pro-alliance hawks in the United States, who are pretty skeptical often from folks from the center-left liberal side of South Korean politics. And so, the folks that we talked to both before and after, the summit, I think came away pretty reassured by both leaders, frankly. They've also been very worried about what Trump might be willing to do and kind of how far he would push on the defense cost side of things, whether this was the kind of thing, many of those observers were worried of kind of a worst case scenario in their view of, kind of historic rupture in the alliance. And that was something that was, kind of openly discussed of a possibility of that we might see that. And so I think, again, they came away from that quite relieved that both leaders, seemed willing to, not push on any of those areas and kind of come together, at least, again, at the big picture level.
Well said. Katrin, anything to add on top of that?
Yeah, I would just say on the U.S. side, it's still uncertain how much this is going to kind of capture, attention in the U.S., given the fact that, not because this isn't an important meeting, but the amount of news in a cycle under the Trump administration is quite remarkable. And yesterday was no exception. So for all of us who were, hitting reset, trying to see if there's a joint statement, I noted time and time again, there were 4 other fact sheets that came out yesterday, right, having to do with domestic issues. And so for our press, White House press, there's a lot to follow, right? So it's not that this isn't important, there's just so much out there, right? And in a way, that's also a blessing, because if you think about it, if there were some headline, it might have been something that might not necessarily have, it might have been something dramatic that if we're talking about, stability in this relationship being a good thing, that might not have been a good thing. I think the important thing for the U.S. public, though, to see generally is that, after, a major headline in December with the Yoon Sung-yeol calling for martial law, that confused people big time here. Again, it's like friends of mine who know vaguely that I work on Korea issues, like friendship circles. I follow foreign policy a little bit. Maybe they're like, "What's going on over there?" Right? And wow, the world is going, spinning out of control. Like that means that the place that produces K-pop and my Samsung phone's like, that's happening over there, right? And so I would say to them, like, just watch, Korea will get out of this. It will come through this. Look at all that Korea's been through, and it's this is just Korea has stood the test of time, going through the fire and coming out, right? So Lee Jae-myung came to deliver that message. I mean, he delivered it most clearly in the CSIS speech, kind of trying to frame, like, here I am, the leader of South Korea. We're back. And also framing it as a positive, a strength for the democracy. We went through this leadership crisis. We did it with songs and no bloodshed and no chaos, right? So that's a really important message that I think will land, right? Even if this isn't like the front and center news headline in the United States, it's an important one to kind of get back into the overall mindset of what's going on in South Korea.
Very good point.
If I could just add off of
yeah,
what
please.
Katrin said right there. Interestingly enough, I think in some ways, despite kind of the change in political spectrum that happened, in some ways, South Korea may have benefited a bit by having a president who can be Trump's South Korean president. So often or Trump seems motivated by what he doesn't like, and we know that he doesn't like his predecessor, and the fact that Yoon Suk-yeol had been so kind of chummy with Biden, according to some folks we've spoken to, may have colored some of his view of that. And so in some ways, there may have been a bit of a blessing in disguise for South Korea to start from kind of a clean slate going in here.
And another area of alignment for them is the desire to engage with North Korea. And this factored very prominently in the discussion, more so than I had anticipated. So initially, I put the question about North Korea as question number 7 in our discussion here today, but I moved it all the way up to number 3 when I saw how large it loomed during the presser, and then apparently during the luncheon, the closed door session, it was also discussed as well. So President Lee asked about President Trump's willingness to meet with Kim Jong-un again, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un again. And President Trump said he'd be willing to at some time in the appropriate future. So why do we think that this was such a big part of the conversation? And then looking forward, what are the opportunities and obstacles here? Katrin, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Lee was correctly reading that this is an area for a unique alignment with President Trump. So setting off on a strong footing. I think also read very well, like, things Trump likes to talk about, right? Like what gets him animated in a really positive way. So this is also a good one because it's a tangible kind of big news item that he was able to credit Trump and say, you're not a peacekeeper, you're a peacemaker, right? You're actively making progress in the world, and then linking it to a lot of other wins, going 1, 2, 3, right? Like that, look at all you've done, linking North Korea to that. So that's very much in, again, mutual interest in South Korea's interest under Lee Jae-myung's administration, stabilizing the situation with North Korea, and very much, as something that Trump wants to do. We'll see where this leads. There are clearly some opportunities here to see how Kim Jong-un responds. But there's risks as well. I mean, Kim Jong-un and, his sister has very clearly stated, like, we're not interested. We've got Russia now, right? We've got other friends to work with. Not only that, but, we're not going to meet with you if you want to talk about denuclearization, right? So unless you want to recognize us as a nuclear state, which seems to be a non-starter for these leaders, right?
Yeah.
Then even if they did get to the point where they could meet, what kinds of things would President Trump or, depending on who's meeting with the North Korean leader, what would be on the table, right, in order to make progress. So those things are kind of question marks. But I think in terms of, again, the getting the meeting off on a positive footing and speaking to something that Trump feels good about and animated about and really wants to make progress on in the near term, he hit one with this.
Very well said. And another prominent aspect of Kim Yo-jong's recent statements is this attempt to demote South Korea's role as a mediator in the relationship between the U.S. and North Korea, one that South Korea had actively played along the sidelines of the Pyeongchang Olympics that led to the spring of summitry. So that's another apparent factor here impacting what kind of role Lee Jae-myung can play going forward. Josh, over to you for your thoughts on the North Korea piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think Katrin's exactly right. I mean, I think there's kind of few worlds usually where the North Korea question is kind of in some ways the simpler thing to talk about, but that was basically the case here, where compared to tariffs, compared to cost sharing, compared to what role USFK plays, with China, compared to all these other things that are simmering in the background, they're on the same page, at least, talking about North Korea. And so, they focused on that. And also, as Katrin said, I mean, previous U.S. administrations, or at least the last one, did not have a lot of incentive to ever raise North Korea because, it basically just highlighted kind of the lack of progress, the lack of options, everything there. That's not something that Trump has shied away from, and in fact has, shown a real interest in talking about it. But yeah, there is that real question still about, North Korea's willingness to reciprocate. As we saw in, 2017, 2018 with the first Trump administration, they can turn on a dime. So, that could happen. But as you mentioned, I do think Lee inherits that position that the Moon Jae-in administration was in at the end of the Trump administration, which was sidelined basically by both North Korea and the Trump administration. Kim Jong-un seemed to come out of Hanoi really displeased with the South Korean side, and things went quite downhill from there. And Trump doesn't like sharing the stage with anybody really, and so I think even if engagement does come along, there will be a fine line for Lee to try to play of making sure he's involved, but not kind of being seen as stealing any kind of spotlight from Trump.
Thanks very much. Another thing that came up in the discussion is U.S. efforts at arms control discussions with China and Russia. And this popped up during the presser, and then during the closed door luncheon session, President Trump asked President Lee about North Korea's relationship with Russia and North Korea's relationship with China. So President Trump showing some interest in Korea's regional role and Korea's perception of regional relations. So just want to ask a general question about, and please take your pick of what you feel motivated to answer. Is a regional arms control type infrastructure one way to solve the riddle of dealing with North Korea? Of course, Kim Jong-un would welcome that kind of framing, right, to get away from denuclearization. But that could potentially have some long-term implications, right, if the U.S. were to abandon that as a long-term goal. And then next, how does this larger geopolitical context influence the ability or inability to get progress in terms of rapprochement with North Korea? So either of those things that are of interest to you, Katrin, Josh, anybody want to go first?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that he used the term denuclearization in the context of China and Russia, but didn't mention North Korea, which is an interesting thing, right? Because you're used to kind of hearing arms control in the kind of Cold War context of great power dynamics, and denuclearization in the context of North Korea. So it was a little bit, I mean, maybe for all of them it'll be denuclearization, and we're talking arms control in along the way. I mean, Trump doesn't like nuclear weapons, right? That's something that he's talking. They're dangerous. There's way, he very clearly said, okay, we need less of these things. They're too risky, right? Which is something a lot of people, can get on board with and say, great. But again, the devil's in the details. I mean, are we going to get back into arms control discussion with Putin? That's something that, was kind of raised in the context of Alaska. But first things first, how about Ukraine, right? I think generally on the kind of triangle here, what might be really interesting is that I think we're heading into like fall of symmetry. And if Trump is in fact, planning to meet with Xi Jinping, has met with Putin, not that those aren't necessarily going to be easy meetings, but he wants to go into these meetings with a kind of optimistic tone. Let's make progress. We'll see how Kim Jong-un feels about being left out of that, right? So that's a new dynamic. That's something that's been a bit stuck, right? Since the start of the Biden administration. It's a bit of a judo move, honestly. It kind of puts a little bit of a twist into these triangular alignments, into the so-called CRINC, right? We've got Iran in there as well. That's an interesting thing. I'm not saying this is Trump's strategy, but it might be kind of an outcome of shaking things up a little bit. I'd like to meet with you. I have a great relationship with you. I don't know if it's going to go well. I sure hope it does. I've got something in my back pocket. I don't want to use it, right? So that kind of an approach to the meeting, that's pragmatism, right? In Trump's terms, that's also pragmatism in Lee Jae-myung's terms. So there's an alignment there as well.
And of course, the prospect of a settlement in Ukraine could spell changes for North Korea's relationship with Russia. So if North Korea wants to look beyond that at the long-term horizon, that perhaps this strategy of hedging and of playing two sides against the middle could once again mean a role for the U.S. and South Korea. Josh, any other thoughts here?
Yeah, no, I mean, just to add, I mean, at those kind of calls or thinking about freeze/arms control, scenarios have definitely been growing in Washington. Again, we saw that, in the first Trump administration, among some saying, this was kind of a realistic goal for what, was going on there. And Lee Jae-myung seems to have basically laid that out as his, at least as some of the steps in his three-step process, still with that kind of stated goal of denuclearization, but then having kind of freeze and control on there. I think a big question is one, what incentives at a certain point does Kim Jong-un have to agree to that, especially if pressure campaigns, as even Lee has said, have failed against North Korea right now, and now they've got the relationship with Russia and other things that have taken off some of that other pressure. So there's that. And then there was also, as we saw kind of the first time around with Trump is, he was able to get in the room with Kim Jong-un, get him even to places that seemed unlikely at certain points, but then kind of capitalizing on that in terms of, anything concrete, ultimately all, kind of fell apart, in part in some cases because Trump himself seemed willing to kind of walk away from, less than kind of perfect deals as a negotiating tactic kind of thing. So again, if we even ever got to that point again in the near future, then that, I think will be one of the challenges for them.
Well said. Okay, and let's transition to MASGA, which stands for Make American Shipbuilding Great Again. As of course, as part of this deal to address tariffs and reduce the tariffs from 25% U.S. tariffs on South Korea from 25% to 15%. South Korea has pledged $350 billion in investments, and $150 billion of that is earmarked for shipyards, ships, and maintenance. So shipbuilding, how important is this for the overall relationship? Josh, over to you first.
This has been really a linchpin of South Korea's pitch to Washington during the tariff talks. Not only kind of at the detailed level, but also just at the PR level. Coming up with that slogan, printing off hats, giving them out. Really kind of going all out to show that or portray this as a key part of Trump's agenda, and they seem that seems to have gone well for them. so far. We're expecting to see a lot more of this. Leah is going to visit that Philly shipyard that's owned by Hanwha later today, and so that I think kind of again shows some of the importance that they're placing on this. To kind of quote, I guess, kind of the mantra of all of this, though, the devil is still in the details. They've announced dollar amounts in some cases. We also right in the wake of the summit, we had some partnerships announced with Samsung, Hyundai, and some other companies on shipbuilding and maintenance and naval cooperation, things like that. But experts that we've talked to and South Korean officials, say that shipbuilding in the United States is really dogged by a lot of the issues that manufacturing in general struggles with in the United States. So a lack of trained workforce and now supply chain issues, which have kind of exacerbated by other steps that Trump has taken with steel and other things like that. And so there's kind of real questions about how kind of quickly they can actually get some of these facilities up and running in any kind of meaningful way. And Trump himself seemed to allude to that in some of his comments, basically saying that they were initially going to buy more ships from South Korea directly, which is something that South Korea has wanted to do and has been doing more. But even that, has some challenges because of the Jones Act and some other legislation, American legislation that has been in place for decades, but basically, limits the way some American ships can be used. For example, ships that are used between American ports need to be built in the United States, or at least mostly. And then there's other legislation that dictates the way militarily sensitive vessels are built. And so South Korean officials have been lobbying for years to try to get those eased. And they say that removing some of those barriers will be key to them being able to kind of make good on some of these promises to help Trump in the end.
That's really good perspective, Josh. And it just seems that Korea has all this capacity and America has all this need, and yet there's a lot of complexity here. Katrin, over to you for any additional thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, Josh did a fantastic job on the complexity side. Just on the broader framing side, though, I think, back to my earlier point on Lee, framing the relationship in terms of pragmatic diplomacy in national interests. This is, as, Jonathan, you just alluded to, this is an area where, Trump likes these tangible trades. I have something that that you have something I want, and this can be a win-win, right? And so even putting that in Trump's terms, MAGSA, that's very smart. It is a kind of it trips people up. Is it MAGSA or MAG? Anyway, but it says I'm even going to put this on a bumper sticker for you, right? And we can make this a headline together. So certainly we'll see in time, like, what actually comes of this. And Trump himself has alluded to this renaissance being something that is going to take time. But in of itself, it gives that tangible example of what is meant by, an alliance, for our new time, taking care of domestic interests, right? At the same time, finding mutual interests, right? So it gives a concrete example of that.
Really great point. So now we can zoom out and look at trade more generally, trade and economics. And as we've talked about, one of the quotes that I wrote down was when President Trump said, well, we're going to get along great because we really need each other. He talked about Korea and Japan partnering on a joint venture to deliver oil and gas from Alaska. They also talked about nuclear energy cooperation as well. And then at the business leaders roundtable after the summit, there was all types of new contracts and MOUs announced. So lots of activity there. Josh, can you kick us off and talk a little bit more about the general economic relationship and what we saw come out of this summit?
Sure. Well, one of the observations that I heard from one of the experts I spoke to in the wake of this, they argued that basically Trump's very pressure and kind of, he's singled out South Korea over the years, kind of for specific, pressure over defense costs or other things. This one take was basically that, Trump has done that precisely because he sees South Korea as being of so much value to the United States, being such a manufacturing powerhouse, a base for U.S. troops. He does in the end understand the value of some of that, and has therefore tried to extract further value from that for the United States. And so I do think that as we've talked some a bit already, things went well at the really high level because the Lee administration has been able to highlight that, whether it's shipbuilding, whether it's at least showing interest in the Alaska gas pipeline. Again, that's another one where the million caveats and a lot of questions over where that goes, but they've signaled that willingness to play ball, and therefore have gotten a good reception in Washington on that. I think at the really high level as well, they've been able to provide at least enough to Trump that he can hang his hat on this. Hyundai went out of their way really early on to announce big deals in investments in Georgia. We had Korean Air just announced their to coincide basically with the summit, the biggest purchase of airliners ever for them from Boeing. And so again, as Katrin talked about, Trump likes kind of those tangible things. He likes bumper sticker slogans and deals. South Korea, I think, has been able to provide that at least to a certain degree.
Thank you very much. Katrin, over to you.
Yeah, I would say, Trump saying we need each other is just kind of like echoing what Lee Jae-myung was saying on the other side, right? Like just basically acknowledging that this is a relationship that's based in real tangible things, that we need each other. So that in and of itself was important, in addition to him saying, I like South Korea, right? But we also need each other. So if you just like someone, it's not going to carry water, right, under this administration. The details, yes, we don't quite know what the details were that were discussed. It might be part of why we're not seeing a joint statement. That it might also be because some of those details are going to be coming out of these private sector interactions. Our vibrant private sector, complementarities is something that is also, a really unique thing about this relationship. So we'll just have to watch that space.
Very good. So moving on to the alliance, and going into the summit, there were some questions about whether the cost sharing or potential for troop withdrawal, strategic flexibility was going to be on the table during the discussion. President Trump even asked by a reporter, and he was about the potential for troop withdrawal. And he said, well, I don't want to say that now because we've been friends and we are friends. At the CSIS event, President Lee said that Korea will increase defense spending. So what are your important takeaways here? Let's start with you, Katrin.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a relief to not go into details, particularly on strategic flexibility. I think that there were areas that Lee Jae-myung was more comfortable talking about in a bigger sense, mentioning that in the CSIS speech. But overall, I think trying to frame this in a broader context of updating the alliance for the present day. We can work on these things behind closed doors. This one's a really sensitive one for Lee Jae-myung because of the implications in the near term, the signals it might send, which are not good for either partner. But we don't know if there was going to be overt pressure there. So overall, this could also be something that's holding up the joint statement. We don't know. But Trump actually showed himself to be okay with the broader brushstrokes, at least in the public setting. So that was an interesting takeaway for me.
Right. Josh, over to you.
I mean, actual troop withdrawal from South Korea has always been one of those things that again, Trump has occasionally hinted at, but has never been kind of his focus as much as it's been, the paying more, right? And then kind of the implication that if that doesn't happen, then he'll kind of withdraw. So I don't know that I read a huge amount into, him saying, "Oh, I'm not going to, talk about that at this time." Again, he has seemed most focused on trying to get South Korea to pay more for that, more than necessarily wanting to pull out troops immediately for that. But yeah, I think this was definitely one of those areas that they were, again, happy with kind of big picture stuff, because Lee was willing, as he showed, to commit to broadly spend more on defense, whether that means purchasing more from the United States, whether it means just simply spending more on their military, whether that means spending more under an SMA agreement for the U.S. troops. That is still very unclear, but some of that will make a big difference. I also think that when the discussion of kind of the base real estate is another one of those areas where it's hard to know whether that's going to become a thing or not. Trump is a real estate guy at heart. We see him apply that to so many issues around the world, whether that's Gaza and beach resorts, whether that's North Korea and beach resorts, whether that's the real estate for bases. It's one of those things where, again, there's kind of like details that we'll just have to see. I think another challenge for South Korea, and one of the reasons why they were happy to kind of tiptoe around it, is that Trump has also continued to kind of repeat. I don't know whether it's a misunderstanding or just garbled, this line that, that he had arranged for South Korea to pay a lot more for the troop presence, and then Biden stopped that. And it's really unclear what he's referring to there, because, of course, that arrangement has continued, and in fact, the Biden administration got some agreements where they continued to actually increase those contributions. So again, it's one of those conversations that I think Lee does not want to have in public, where you're starting kind of from a position where it's, again, kind of unclear what the base facts are in the first place. And so I think they managed to dance around that in a way that worked out.
Couple of other, very well said. And I'll just put a couple of other issues regarding the alliance on the table for discussion. One of them is this flexibility around joint defensive exercises. We saw some of those get delayed for the purpose of creating favorable conditions for engagement with North Korea. And then in a statement, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, rejected that as the kind of overture that could lead to positive progress. And then the other issue regarding the alliance that's in active development, and we don't know just where it's going to go, is the possibility of transfer of wartime operational control. Just to briefly break that down, right now, if a war were to break out, the USFK, CFC, UNC commander would take control of much of South Korea's military, not all military forces. And there's been in the works for decades now a transition of that wartime operational control back to South Korean commander answering to a bilateral military commission, right? So a bit of nuance here. But Lee Jae-myung has expressed an interest in completing wartime operational control within his presidency. So 5 years to accomplish that. And this is something that's not happened thus far, right, for a variety of reasons. But Katrin, we'll start with you. Thoughts on either of those items?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of OPCON transition, of course, that's something that has been discussed for a very long time. And it's not necessarily one that can't be worked out, in an alignment sense. I mean, President Lee Jae-myung said South Korea is ready to take, responsibility for its own, more responsibility for its own defense, right? The two things are time horizon. and the degree of the public nature of these discussions, right? In terms of it looking like some pressure point and that there's a rift. I think all of this whole basket of issues can certainly be discussed, but ideally at the working levels and kind of from the bottom up. This isn't the approach that Trump often takes, but these are such sensitive issues in terms of overall deterrence and the appearance of the strength of the alliance, that it would have to be carefully managed. I mean, of course, we've also talked about a conditions-based approach to op-gun transfer, which remains, the case. But within the broad spectrum of things, this could be something that isn't necessarily a misalignment. It has been in the past. So overall, I mean, with this whole basket of issues, I think the danger is that like we could break down these distinct alliance equity issues and kind of trade them off in deals with North Korea and that sort of thing, or even within the alliance itself. I think that's a big danger in terms of this overarching issue of deterrence. Deterrence in and of itself, I'm sure Trump understands, but it's a really hard bumper sticker for him because it's one that is, stopping bad things from happening instead of making things happen, right? So I mean, those who really understand what motivates Trump, like Steve Witkoff said in the Oval Office setting with reference to something else, that's the guy that makes things happen, right? That's and I think E.J. Myung understands that as well. The challenge is, we need deterrence to continue. One idea I had is the good news is all of these smaller pieces can be kind of bumper sticker headlines for strengthening the alliance, and the outcome of those things is strong deterrence. But maybe we should frame shift a little bit, because I think that particular bumper sticker isn't one that Trump can take credit for. It's something that many leaders over time have upheld deterrence, right? And that we still need it. But let's talk about these things and how they connect with each other, and not trade them away, because they are interconnected, right? So I'll leave it there.
Right. Well put. Josh, over to you.
Well, maybe I can take the drills. I mean, I think that is one of the areas that it seems both from, based on what the steps that Trump took during his first term, but then also, some of the signals we've seen from the Lee administration, that could be an area that we see, them take some, some even potentially, unilateral steps on at some point to try to, entice North Korea to the table. I think there's one of the challenges that they seemed to run into last time they rolled some of this back under Trump was basically the assertion that they're not provocative, they're not being done to threaten North Korea, they're not any kind of political messaging, they're simply a matter of maintaining readiness for troops, as all militaries do, that kind of thing. North Korea has gone out of its way to highlight what they feel is hypocrisy there, of saying, like, when we do it, then you say it's provocation and not our right, and all of this. And then so when then the political leaders decide to roll it back, then there's again they roll into that basically admission of saying yes, this is a demonstration of force against North Korea, and maybe North Korea has a reason to be mad about some of this then in the end. So I would imagine some of those debates would probably arise immediately if we start to get some movement there. At the same time, I spoke to very senior members of USFK who were leaders back under that period when things were ostensibly rolled back under the Trump administration, and they told me that effectively they just stopped talking about them and they just kept doing them. And I think, we saw a lot of, from a practical standpoint, maybe some, less live fire near the border, things that were covered by the inter-Korean, military agreement, things like that. But, in the end, U.S. military sources I spoke to basically said, again, a lot of it was just PR. They just didn't invite us media along in the way that they had, during 2017 when they were trying to highlight all of that activity, but then kind of just continued them because, in their view, every time they went back and, testified to Congress, then they got questions over, well, are you maintaining readiness? Are you actually ready to fight? And so their way of threading that needle was basically to keep carrying out these drills, but then just not talk about them. That could also be an element that we could see happen where they, continue, but we just see less visibility.
So a subtle shift from deterrence via punishment to deterrence by denial, just demonstrating and developing the capabilities to make it more difficult for North Korea to engage in those provocations and coercion effectively to raise the cost of doing so. And I'm glad you brought up the inter-Korean, the CMA, Comprehensive Military Agreement, signed during the Moon Jae-in administration, which was scrapped during the Yoon Suk-yeol administration due to North Korean provocations that violated the terms of the agreement. And President Lee Jae-myung has expressed an interest in re-engaging with that agreement as a way to build confidence and reduce the likelihood of an accidental collision around the border. Any thoughts about the viability and prospects of that and how enticing that could be for North Korea?
I think North Korea has to engage South Korea first. They have to, show willingness to talk again, right? So sorry, go ahead, Josh.
No, that was exactly it. I think there's it's whether it's good. It's all going to depend on whether it aligns with a broader goal. If Kim Jong-un decides that, he wants to launch that kind of engagement, then, I think we could see, something there. One of the trickier parts, though, and this goes back to, one thing we haven't discussed, but it goes to kind of that question we were discussing earlier about South Korea as, kind of a mediator. North Korea has made some, major changes to the way that it, at least on paper, views South Korea, kind of abandoning, the official goal of unification, calling it a main enemy, things like this. Again, it's not anything that Kim Jong-un can't decide necessarily to change if he wants, but it is just that many more kind of signals of how, they may not see, engaging with South Korea as kind of the first step that they're going to take, as a way to Trump.
Thank you very much. And next, Katrin, we'll go to you because this is a topic that you've studied for a very long time and are a leading expert on, and that's trilateral U.S., Korea, Japan relations. So I'm sure when you saw that President Lee Jae-myung was going to stop over in Japan for a summit with Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, you felt heartened by that, and they produced a joint statement the first time in 17 years that Korea and Japan produced a joint statement. And then it was covered very positively during the discussion with Trump and Lee. Can you tell us a little bit about the nuts and bolts of that meeting and why trilat matters and how it impacts the way that the U.S. and Korea's partnership develops?
Yeah, so nuts and bolts is kind of a term that's tough to get to in the details, right? The really sensitive things, of course, weren't raised, so it's a bit of a similar dynamic with the Trump Lee Jae-myung meeting. But again, I'll take my own personal work, and I'll take the win of Lee Jae-myung going to Japan and signaling, a continuity with his predecessor's stance on Japan, continuing summit diplomacy. That's a really important move. The first time a South Korean president has, I guess since normalization, has gone first to Japan. There was some, I think there's two ways to read that. One is, that's, indicating that Japan and South Korea, that this leg is going to be strengthened even stronger than the bilats. I don't see it that way. I think Lee Jae-myung was very careful in the Oval Office to say, President Trump, I know you think the trilat's important. I know you want us to get along. I did that on the way here, right? So as much as these two leaders can certainly trade notes, and we're trading notes because they're, under similar pressure points on trade and security issues, I think both have a lot of incentive to not frame this as we're going to gang up on the United States and we're going to get leverage from this. Maybe they will, but just the overall framing in terms of a strong trilateral that's, in everyone's interest, I think, is the positive from this, that Trump also, again, win-win-win in a trilateral sense. Everybody's on board with this. And so that's a great takeaway.
That's a really useful framework. Josh, any additional thoughts on this trilat?
I would just say, again, we mentioned how Lee came into office with a lot of skepticism over his, how he views the relationship with the United States, how he views the relationship with China, and Japan was a very big one, given his very sharp criticism of the Yoon engagement with Japan, as well as what happened under, the previous Democratic Party administration of Moon Jae-in, where relations got really, really bad as both sides kind of deepened some of those disputes. And so the message does seem to be that whether it particularly strengthens or not, I guess we'll see. But he seems to be trying to send the message that if this relationship tanks, it's not because of me. I'm here, I'm doing this. Doesn't mean at some point they might not express annoyance with something Japan does. They had some sharp words again over visits to the shrine during the recent holiday, things like that. But I think he is trying to again send that message: if this relationship deteriorates again, it's not my fault. I'm going here. I'm trying to show good faith.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And that's a wrap on the moderator questions. And now we get the pleasure of turning to our audience questions. So thank you so much for tuning in and watching us live and sending your questions in live. We're staying on top of all that. But first, we're going to start with the questions that our members sent in prior to the program. So Chelsie, over to you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a question from James Bretsky at John Carroll University, who is a Korea Society member, and he asks the following. Historically, the U.S.-ROK relationship has been framed around shared values and security interests. If the Trump administration emphasizes a more transactional approach, how might that affect Seoul's alliance strategy and day-to-day diplomacy with Washington? And so either of you feel free to jump in and share your thoughts.
Yeah, I think both leaders are aligned in this space and kind of moving away from using the values as a way to frame the alliance strength. I read that as it's an intangible for again back to this tangibility for President Trump. It's kind of like the opposite, I guess, of pragmatism. We'll reach out to anyone. I'll talk to anybody, right? That said, there are things about this relationship that, I mean, the fact that you're able to sit down with these two leaders and have a really positive experience. It goes for 2.5 hours. The dynamics were good. A lot of that comes from the fact that these are two democracies, right? That do have alignment, that it's easier to transact with, to have trusting kind of deals with. Our private sectors can make deals together. That in and of itself makes an atmosphere for success, right? Contrast that with Trump and Putin and the body language there. I mean, I read that as an outcome of different regime types, right? Trying to deal with each other. So I'm not one that says values are no longer important. We're stepping away from that in terms of talking about it. Again, under the banner of pragmatism, I still think that the fact that these are two, democracies with, capitalist economies, makes for an easier relationship vis-a-vis the other relationships that both are trying to build.
I think I would say, I mean, clearly the relationship has been framed as around values, and we saw a lot of that talk under, the last administration of Yoon Suk-yeol. But I think there was also always kind of a question of, how much the talk aligned with the actual actions on that. And I think that, even at the economic level, Biden was quite transactional in the way that he, tried to protect, U.S. businesses. Yoon Suk-yeol was, the sales, he called himself, the top salesman for South Korea, and a lot of his international engagement in the end was basically synonymous with the deals he was, inking for South Korean businesses and arms dealers around the world. So yeah, as Katrin said, we might see a change in some of the way that's talked about. But I think maybe in some ways, some of that shift might be a little bit overstated as well, just given, kind of the focus that both countries have had for a long time.
Yep. Thank you both. That's really great. I want to shift over to a question from Korea Society member Tim Richards, former North Korean strategic debriefer and independent advisor on DPRK affairs. So his question kind of focuses on the war in Ukraine. He asks, do you expect any outcomes from the Trump-Lee summit that could deter or constrain further DPRK support for Russia's war in Ukraine? And if so, through what mechanisms? And kind of on top of that, both leaders in the US and South Korea have signaled roles in post-war Ukraine. So do you think that the US and Korea are aligned in their views of on their objectives in the war in Ukraine? Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think, all right, go Josh.
no, go ahead.
Okay. I think that that these leaders are quite, again, not to overuse the term, but the leaders, at least DJ Myung uses it quite a lot, pragmatism, is shift away from President Yoon's stance on Ukraine, and it aligns with President Trump's shift, right? So I think that in terms of North Korea, we'll see how much changes on the Ukraine front impact Russia-North Korea ties. We'll see how much that is kind of purely transactional. Surely it might have started that way, but time will tell. And there are a lot of steps that they've taken to demonstrate that we really mean it. Like, this isn't just about Ukraine. So we'll just have to sit and watch. But in terms of kind of these two leaders, Trump and Lee Jae-myung's positions vis-a-vis Russia, I think again there's alignment in this kind of step away from values-based, I guess, explaining of actions in this space and more towards pragmatism.
Yeah, I mean, to the first question there, no, I didn't see anything at least immediate that might have any impact on their the relationship there, and DPRK support for the war. I think kind of maybe as Jonathan mentioned, I think rather than anything happening in North Korea that might affect the way things are happening in Ukraine, I think it might be more likely that developments in Ukraine will affect, what's happening in Russia DPRK relations, and so, for better or worse, I have no idea. As Katrin said, I don't think, they've both taken steps to really, deepen that, and they, even if Ukraine ended tomorrow, they would still probably find at least, some upsides to that. But it would, I think, change some of the dynamics more than kind of the other direction. It's hard to see something happening in North Korea that would necessarily change their support for Russia in Ukraine at this point. But depending on what happens in Ukraine, then that may change the way eventually Russia and North Korea are dealing with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for that. And I think we can end on one last question from our member, Jay Cho. Throughout the Trump-Lee summit, Trump asked President Lee about his thoughts on China-North Korea and also North Korea-Russia relations. And so Jay Cho's question is, to what extent does Lee's record indicate a tilt toward Beijing? And if such a tilt exists, how would it shape Seoul's stance on export controls, extended deterrence, and trilateral coordination with the US and Japan? So kind of focusing on the role of China in the US-ROK relationship.
Yeah, I'll take it for now. I think Lee Jae-myung is being very careful to, kind of, it's called normalize relations with China, but make sure that not at the expense of relationship with the United States. As you saw, there is some alignment there as well. They're both talking about meeting with Xi Jinping. Trump even mentioned, "Oh, would you like to come with me and we'll meet together?" So I think there's alignment, again, not to overuse the term, in terms of pragmatism. This stance that both are willing to meet with him, see how it goes. Try for a good relationship. I think a strong indicator that Lee Jae-myung is also being very careful is he was invited to the Victory Day parade in September. Park Geun-hye went to the one 10 years ago, the first time a South Korean president had attended one. I think it was the first time the foreign leaders went to it, 2015, right? And this was 2015, kicked up a lot of I think, concern. It's a different time period in the U.S. alliance. So is she leaning towards China too much? Of course, she was a conservative president, so it was a kind of an interesting contrast with Lee Jae-myung. Lee Jae-myung is not going to the Victory Day parade, but he did send a special envoy this week. I mean, he's trying. So I think there are things he could have done that would show maybe going too far. Standing next to leaders, like potentially Kim Jong-un and Putin, right? Without any leaders of alliances or democracies. That would be maybe a step too far. And so the fact that I don't think even considering that because of the sensitivities around making sure it doesn't impact the U.S. alliance, that's coming first. That's the North Star. I don't read Lee Jae-myung as tilting, that the U.S. would read him as tilting too much towards Beijing, at least under these two leaders right now.
Agree so far. And I think that, again, even the invitation to Xi, right? I mean, that was a long time goal of the Yoon administration, who was seen as, as some kind of China hawk, but in reality also really tried to balance, South Korea's both business and political interests with China. And so in a lot of ways, what we've seen so far, there are more similarities, I think, than differences there. One of the other things that I think Lee probably has in mind that would be different, maybe than if he had been president some time ago is South Korea's public opinion. It's not just Washington's view of how he might relate to China, but a lot of, surveys show really dim views among many South Koreans towards China. And so I think, to a certain degree, he's also got that to keep in mind as well. So it's both Washington, but also he has some interests at home that I think will guide his thinking on this.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for answering those questions, and also to our virtual audience members who submitted questions. Yeah, and I'll turn it over to Jonathan to close us out.
Thank you very much, Chelsie. Thanks to everyone for joining us here this morning. Thank you so much to Josh and Katrin. Smashing job. We're so grateful that you provided your expert views and provided a lot of clarity on what was a dramatic summit with a lot of ins and outs to delve into. We hope that you'll join us again. September 18th, we've got a program on the unseen resilience of North Korean defectors. And then on October 8th, we welcome back Professor Chung Kyung-sup for a discussion on his new book regarding Korea's compressed modernity and its risks. So lots of exciting things coming up in the policy space here at the Korea Society. We hope you join us as a member. You can go to koreasociety.org to learn more about that. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.